Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty interesting today. A case from the Indian Supreme Court. And yeah, we're going to be looking at how they decide on compensation in, wrongful death cases.
Always a sensitive topic.
It really is. And the case we're looking at today involves a young engineering student, Nilesh.
Tragic case.
Yeah, he was killed in a motorcycle accident. His parents ended up suing the truck driver and the owner.
Went all the way to the Supreme Court, too.
I know. It makes you think, right? Like, how do these decisions get made?
Right.
So before we get into the legal stuff, maybe you can, set the scene for us. What happened to Nilesh?
So Nilesh was 19 years old, an engineering student, and he was on his motorcycle when a truck hit him. His parents obviously were devastated, and they wanted compensation. The High Court initially granted them about $8,000.
Wait, $8,000? That's what, $100?
Yeah, roughly. And the parents, understandably, felt like that was way too low, so they appealed for more.
I can see why. It's interesting, though, right? It went all the way to the Supreme Court. It makes you wonder how they figure out these compensation amounts in India. Like, what do they even consider?
That's where the whole idea of loss of dependency comes in. It's basically trying to figure out how much financial support the family has lost because of this death. And to be consistent and fair, the Supreme Court, they use past judgments and a specific method, the multiplier method, I think it's called.
Multiplier method. Okay, so what is that exactly?
Well, it takes into account things like the deceased age, how much they were making, and what their future might have looked like career-wise, all to figure out a fair compensation amount.
Okay. So, how does it work? Do they have a set formula or something?
It's like a three-part equation, kind of. They start with figuring out the person's yearly income, and then they look at potential raises they might have gotten down the line.
So, in Nilesh's case, they'd look at what he was making as a student, but also, how much he could have made later on as an engineer.
Exactly. They try to project what his earnings would have been.
That makes sense. So what's the next part of this equation?
That's where the multiplier comes in. It's a number they assign based on things like age and career prospects. And the Supreme Court actually has these tables, to help them decide on the right number. So someone younger, like Nilesh, who could have had a long career, well, they'd likely get a higher number.
Oh, okay. So a higher number means more compensation, basically.
Right. It reflects all those potential years of income the years the family's lost out on.
Got it. So younger people, promising careers, higher multiplier. What's the last step?
The last step's pretty straightforward. They just multiply the income by the multiplier. That number, that's what they call the loss of dependency amount. It's basically the money the family's lost because of the death.
Trying to predict the future, huh? Not an easy thing to do.
You got it. There's always uncertainty there. And the courts, they got to balance that with being fair to the family, who's going through all this.
Yeah, definitely. It's like they're trying to figure out what someone's life would have been worth, financially speaking.
Yeah, kind of. And to see this in action, the judgment actually references a few past cases. Like there's one called UPSRTC v. Trilok Chandra. It really stresses using this multiplier method to get a fair amount, a just amount.
So they're aiming for consistency, but each case is different too. So this multiplier method is like a starting point, but what else did the Supreme Court look at in Nilesh's case?
Well, they also consider these conventional amounts. They're basically fixed sums they add for certain losses that are hard to put a price on, like, loss of companionship or funeral costs.
Oh, right. So that's to acknowledge the emotional side of things, not just the financial part.
Exactly. Losing someone's about more than just money, right? These amounts are supposed to take that into account. And it's not just adding those amounts, They also think about future raises the person might have gotten. Like Nilesh, as a young engineer, he probably would have seen his salary go up a lot during his career.
So they're factoring in, his earning potential, not just what he was making at that moment. But how do they even decide how much to add for that?
They look at, industry trends, how much engineers' salaries usually increase, even Nilesh's grades. And if he had big career goals, did he graduate at the top of his class? Was he really ambitious? Things like that.
Wow. They really do go deep into the details, don't they? But he wouldn't have spent all his money on his family, right?
Oh, right. They take that into account, too. They deduct some of the income for, personal expenses, stuff Nilesh would have spent on himself.
Okay, makes sense. How much do they usually deduct?
Well, that depends. Marital status, dependence, all that plays a role. Someone married with kids, they deduct more than someone single because, more of their income would go to their family. For Naresh, they'd consider that he was young, not married, lives with his parents.
So they're really trying to pinpoint how much of his income would have actually gone to his parents. Pretty detailed stuff.
They're trying to be as precise as possible, yeah.
Yeah.
Make sure the compensation really reflects the family's actual loss. And, to show how all of this actually works, the judgment talks about a few other cases. Each one shows a different side of this whole process. It's pretty complicated.
Yeah, I saw they mentioned a bunch of other cases. Lata Wadhwa, M.S. Karal, Arvind Kumar Mishra. They're using those as examples, right? What can we learn from them?
Definitely. Lata Wadhwa, that one was about a terrible accident where 60 people died, a lot of them children.
Mm.
And that case, it had to deal with, how do you even compensate when a child dies? It's a tough one because kids don't have a job or a career path yet.
That's a really good point. So how did they approach that in Lata Wadhwa?
They realized that, a child's death is different and you can't calculate things the same way. They focused on the child's age and how long they would have relied on their parents. Younger kids, they'd usually get more because, they need their parents for longer.
So even though kids don't have an income, the court still understands that families lose a lot, both financially and emotionally.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing that potential, the potential that's lost when a child dies. And the court, they awarded a pretty big sum to those families.
So MS Gruel, what happened there?
MS Girl involved 14 students, all from a pretty well-off school. And the interesting thing is the court considered how much money the school had when they decided on the compensation.
Wait, really? How come?
Well, their reasoning was that a richer school, they have more responsibility to keep their students safe, right? So if something happens, they should pay more.
So it's not just about the person who died, but also who's responsible and their financial situation. That's interesting.
It's about making sure the compensation's fair for both sides. So, a party that's not as well off, they don't get stuck with a huge amount they can't afford.
That makes sense. What about Arvind Kumar Mishra? What was different about that one?
In that case, it was about this young engineering student. He got really hurt in a road accident. And the main point there was figuring out future earnings when someone's career is just starting. The court looked at his education, what jobs were out there for engineers, even potential raises and promotions, things he might have gotten throughout his career.
So they were thinking long-term about how his injuries would affect his whole working life.
Yeah. And they decided on an amount that reflected all that income he'd potentially lose. Arvind Kumar Mishra really shows how thorough the courts try to be, thinking about the future and everything.
It's amazing how these cases, each with its own unique story, help us understand how compensation is determined in India. It really shows what factors the courts consider and the principles they follow.
And it's easy to get lost in all the legal stuff and the calculations, but we can't forget that these are real people who have suffered a huge loss. The court's decisions, they're grounded in legal stuff and finances, but ultimately they're trying to offer some justice and support to those affected by these tragedies.
That's such an important point. So with all of these precedents and principles in mind, what did the court decide in Nailesh's case? What was the final compensation for his parents?
The Supreme Court, after looking at everything, the multiplier method, the extra amounts, Nailesh's future, the respondent's finances, and all the past cases, they made a pretty big decision. They increased the compensation to $7,000, which is about $8,800, with 6% interest on top of that. That's a big jump from the $8,000 the High Court initially awarded.
Wow, that's a huge difference. Why did they decide to increase it so much? What did they say in their judgment?
Well, the judgment really zeroes in on a couple of things. Like, first off, they said that the initial amount, it just wasn't enough, especially given Nailesh's age and all the potential he had as an engineer. They even brought up that Arvind Kumar Mishra case, saying that both Nailesh and Arvind, they had promising futures that were cut short.
So they saw that Nailesh had a lot to offer, just like in Arvind Kumar Mishra.
Exactly. They weren't just looking at the now, They were thinking about how much he could have earned over his whole career. They took the long view, considering what a typical engineer might make over their lifetime.
And it probably mattered that he was studying engineering, a field where people can earn a good living.
Oh, for sure. They actually mentioned that specifically his engineering degree. Clearly, they thought that meant he was on track for a successful, well-paying career.
That makes sense. So it's not just about what someone's earning when they die. It's about all the potential earnings they've lost.
Exactly. And get this, in their decision, they specifically mentioned the tables from the Susama Thomas case, the ones that help them choose the right multiplier based on age. Remember, those tables are there to keep things consistent when awarding compensation, but like we've seen, The court can adjust things depending on the case.
Right. So the tables are a guide, but they also consider the specific situation, just like they did with that school's finances in the MS Gruel case.
Exactly. It's this balance they have to strike between following the rules and being fair, taking into account the unique parts of each case.
This whole deep dive has been fascinating. We've learned so much about how these compensation decisions are made. It's not just some simple calculation. It's this whole process that involves, like, legal precedents, financial stuff, and most importantly, thinking about how these tragedies affect people's lives.
Totally agree. It's been really interesting going through these cases with you, seeing how the Indian legal system tackles such a tough and sensitive topic.
We started with a simple question, how is compensation determined in wrongful death cases in India? But it turned out to be so much more complicated with all these legal precedents, calculations, and human factors.
And what's really striking is how the court tries to be both consistent and fair. They want to uphold the law, but also recognize that every case is different and that these losses have a huge impact on families.
We saw how they use that multiplier method, but they go beyond just the numbers. They consider future earnings, the respondent's financial situation, even the emotional pain of losing someone.
They're not just looking at figures on a page.
Yeah.
They're trying to understand the whole picture and make sure the compensation is truly just, given all the complexities.
Well, I think our listeners have a lot to think about after this. We've really explored how wrongful death compensation works in India and all the thought that goes into those decisions.
It's a topic people don't always think about, but it's so important for individuals, families, and society as a whole.
And it leaves us with a question: how will all of this change as India keeps developing? As technology changes, as society changes? How will these legal systems adapt to the challenge of figuring out what a human life is worth in these cases?
That's something legal experts and policymakers will keep working on, I'm sure, trying to find answers that are fair and compassionate.
Thanks for taking us through this complex and thought-provoking case. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
It was my pleasure. Always love diving into these legal topics with you.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world around you.